too short. Oh, it's so short. Look in your pants. That'll show you short. Go, woo!
What is up,
Thank you for the
crew?
tier 1.
Today,
Tone.
we're going to be covering another extremely compelling case to continue our series of serial killers you've never heard of. Most people love a good vampire story, as there is just something about vampires that has fascinated humanity
Y'all
for
think vampires was
hundreds
real?
of years. However, the case we have today is one that may make the stories of vampires
Yo, thank you for the tier 1s and Twitch
all
Proms.
too real for
Almost
you.
at 30K. I appreciate y'all.
We're going to talk about a man who earned himself the nickname
And before we
the
get off, we're going to do
Dracula.
some more two sub giveaways.
If you enjoy true
Like 3 more.
crime, mysteries, and true stories, be sure to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get into it. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California. He was primarily in the city by his mother and father, who were alleged to have a rather strict parenting style. At least his mother's parenting style could have been considered strict. His father's actions were far more intense. Richard's father was allegedly violent, especially towards Richard, who was often the primary target of his mood swings. Admittedly, Richard had a rough childhood and, unfortunately, not much improved during his adolescence. By his early teen years, Richard reportedly took out some of his tension through, quote, killing and mutilating animals, in addition to drinking. During his teenage years, it was evident to those around Richard that his behavior was inherently strange and admittedly concerning. And perhaps someone should have paid more attention to such behavior before it was too late. Throughout his high school career, Richard was surprisingly social.
Hey, bitch ass nigga. Hey, you, say, bitch. We just seen this last school in the last video.
He did his best to have a few decent friends, and even managed to have a handful of girlfriends over the years. Unfortunately for Richard, he did not appear to be able to maintain any of these relationships for a variety of reasons. According to various sources, Richard was known to often have a difficult time in the bedroom and would appear to be rather unaroused during instances when he was alone with women.
They all went to the same school.
Upon becoming aware of this issue, Richard brought it up to his psychiatrist, who informed him that the root of his problems could be a result of underlying mental illness or pent-up rage. Receiving this information, Richard didn't appear to process it thoroughly. And so, despite his psychiatrist's advice, Richard decided against seeking any further treatment
this shit
after
never works.
his original
Shit
diagnosis.
just makes it worse.
It wouldn't be until much later in his life
Not gonna
that
cap.
Richard discovered his aversion to conventional intercourse was due to
Subtitles phone for my niggas that really can't see for real. Respect.
his intense interest in much darker forms of intimacy. Perhaps if Richard had decided to seek help then, the events that would come to occur in his adulthood could have been prevented entirely. As an adult, 21-year-old Richard began to develop a variety of abnormal tics that slowly began to characterize his personality. Though his mother had never physically assaulted Richard, as his father allegedly had, Richard gradually came to fear her more and more. In fact, Richard became convinced that his own mother had attempted to kill him with poison. After confronting her on multiple occasions regarding his irrational fear, his father decided that it would be best if Richard moved out of the house. So his father offered to pay Richard's rent in an apartment and essentially forced him to move out of the Chase household. Despite being independent, Richard had a tough time socializing with others. As a result, he found himself with virtually no friends and no romantic relationships either. Instead, Richard spent his time alone in far more sinister ways.
What did he do?
Inside his quaint apartment all by himself, Richard would capture, kill, and disembowel various animals, which he would then devour raw in an animalistic way. You see, Richard's irrational fears started to expand when he was on his own, and they would manifest themselves in rather debilitating ways. Richard became convinced that his heart had slowly been shrinking, and he feared, quote, that if it shrank too much, it would disappear and then he would die. So Richard reasoned that consuming the entrails of the animals he killed in smoothie form would help to prevent further shrinkage of his heart. To do so, Richard would either consume the animals raw, simply blend them up into a blood smoothie, or even mix them with Coke. It was not long after starting such concerning habits that Richard's body began to react negatively. In 1976, Richard was actually hospitalized for blood poisoning after he had injected himself with rabbit's blood as a means of placating his fears. While under medical care, Richard's antics appeared to get worse, not better. In fact, Richard even managed to escape the hospital building just days into his stay. Such an escape warranted hospital staff to send Richard away to a special institution for the criminally insane. Other patients in the facility and even most of the nurses were terrified by the man with a fixation on blood and vampire-like tendencies. In fact, Richard earned himself a nickname while hospitalized: Dracula.
Never supposed to give these
According
niggas
to
nicknames. Why
claims
did they
from
do
other
that?
patients and staff who met Richard, he was frequently found with blood covering parts of his face. When questioned about the smeared blood, Richard would simply claim to have cut himself shaving.
I appreciate it.
The truth of the matter was, in fact,
30K
far
run,
more
30K run.
horrifying. When hospital staff weren't looking, Richard would actually capture birds through his hospital room window and snap their necks before drinking their blood. Richard's actions were both dark and deeply concerning to those who cared for him during his hospital stay. However, it is evident that Richard did not quite receive the care he so desperately needed. After Richard proved that he was capable of consistently taking proper psychotropic medications, he was deemed to no longer be a danger to himself or others. So, just months after his hospitalization and paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis, Richard was released to his parents. Perhaps after such a traumatic experience, Richard's family should have paid closer attention to their son.
They still alive?
Instead, Richard's mother actually claimed that Richard had no need for the anti-schizophrenic medication that the hospital had prescribed. Slowly but surely, his mother helped to wean him off of the medication until he no longer asked for it. Richard's mother and father then discussed their options regarding what exactly to do with him, as he was technically an adult. Ultimately, the two of them decided to once again put Richard up in an apartment that they would pay for in order to keep him out of their way. This would prove to be a disastrous choice, as Richard's behavior only grew darker and more twisted. When Richard was on his own once more and completely off of his medication, he found himself slipping back into his old ways and developing new tendencies. Richard began capturing, torturing, and killing a variety of animals in his neighborhood, including rabbits, dogs, cats, and even pets
nigga, go
belonging
work
to
at
his
Pet
neighbors.
Boys or something since you use
Of
your
course,
hands so much.
after killing each animal, Richard also drank their blood. Sometimes his fascination with killing even led him to go so far as to contact his neighbors via telephone just to admit what he had done. Unfortunately, his violent exploits didn't stop there. As violence and crime began to consume Richard's thoughts, he became increasingly interested in stories about various criminals he had heard of in the news. He became rather obsessed with the crimes committed by the Hillside Strangler, and even believed that the Hillside Strangler had been a victim of the Nazi UFO conspiracy that he believed he was a victim of as well. As his interests expanded, Richard found himself neglecting most normal endeavors in his personal life, including maintaining personal hygiene. Over the course of a few months, Richard almost entirely stopped bathing, grooming, and brushing his teeth. Additionally, he essentially stopped eating, except for when he would consume the blood of the animals he killed. As a result, Richard ended up losing a significant amount of—
Who gave this nigga Monclesi? Yo, who flicked this nigga up? Yo, who took this nigga fit pic? For real, all jokes aside, I swear to God, I'm not trying to be funny. This is actually embarrassing.
Weight over a short period of time.
I'm not even gonna count that fit. Really not even bad, for real. No cap. Okay, real. Okay, serious. Back serious.
Admittedly, Richard's family grew rather concerned with Richard's actions, and yet they did not do much to get him
like he was
the
in the
help
hospital,
he
though.
needed. Even when Richard randomly showed up to his mother's home, holding the lifeless body of a cat he had killed, his mother had virtually no reaction. In fact, Richard reportedly even threw the cat's body to the ground, ripped out its intestines with his bare hands, and smeared its blood across his own face. As his mother watched, she didn't even bat an eyelash.
Oh yeah, you can set the boys free.
She simply stepped back inside the house and shut the door behind her, leaving Richard to his own devices. By August of 1977, Richard's fascination with killing went even deeper. Richard's truck was located in a sand drift near Pyramid Lake, Nevada by state police officers.
Wow.
At first, the officers thought that Richard was inside the vehicle. But then, they heard the screaming. Officers found Richard screaming at the top of his lungs as he lay in the sand completely naked and covered in blood. It looked at first like Richard was the one bleeding. They were shocked to find that the blood had actually come from a cow whose liver was located in a bucket full of blood in the back of Richard's truck, alongside 2 rifles and a pile of clothes.
I'm gonna be honest, what are y'all doing?
Upon initial questioning regarding the incident, Richard had told police that the blood had been his own and that it had, quote, leaked out of him through his flesh. Despite the horrendous nature of the incident, officers simply filed a report and let Richard go. Had police treated the cow slaughter as an indication rather than an oddity, maybe they could have managed to keep Richard safe from himself and keep others safe from him as well. After Richard's incident with the cow, on December 29, 1977, Richard stepped up his criminal game once more. This time, his need for killing could no longer be satiated by taking an animal's life.
Well,
this time, he wanted a human victim. As a 51-year-old man by the name of Ambrose Griffin was helping his wife bring groceries into their home in East Sacramento, Richard watched his every move from his own vehicle just feet away.
Did you?
Ambrose was an engineer and a father of 2 who spent his free time looking after his children and spending time with his loving wife.
Unlike his dumbass parents.
On that fateful day, Ambrose had no idea what kind of dangers were lurking just outside of his own front door. As Ambrose finished unloading the trunk of the Griffin family's car, he didn't notice that Richard had pulled up alongside the curb in front of his house. And before he could even register what was happening, he heard a gunshot. Richard had fired a single shot from his .22 caliber rifle into Ambrose, killing him instantly. As quickly as the crime had started, it was over, and Richard was nowhere to be found.
Wow.
According to the FBI, Richard was not even a person of interest with regard to Ambrose Griffin's death, as the incident had been an almost perfect drive-by shooting with almost no witnesses. The only substantial information that investigators had regarding Ambrose's death was that Ambrose's 2 sons had seen and reported the fact that one of their neighbors had been walking around the neighborhood with a rifle the very same week that their father was killed. According to police records, the neighbor's rifle was actually seized, but it was later determined that it was not the same as the one used in the murder.
Monday's thank you for the twist, Prime.
Having successfully gotten away with what he referred to as his first, quote, warm-up murder, Richard found himself itching for a second attempt. Less than a month later, Richard decided to strike again. This time, on January 11th, 1978, Richard attempted something a little closer to home. Literally. While standing outside his front yard, Richard noticed one of his neighbors smoking and asked if he could bum a cigarette from her. Before she could even answer him, Richard grabbed the woman and forcibly restrained her until she ultimately ended up handing over the entire pack of cigarettes.
Okay,
After having done so, Richard decided to let her go.
Okay, that shit is not funny, but like, nigga. Yo, what, bro? He said she ultimately handed up all of the cigarettes after being choked out. Like, no shit, nigga, she's getting choked? Like, the fuck is she supposed to do?
No. The violence within him, it seemed, bubbled over whenever Richard faced any kind of minor inconvenience. Just 2 weeks after mugging his neighbor for cigarettes, Richard began attempting to enter women's homes in his neighborhood.
He's a fucking weirdo.
According to Richard himself, he took locked doors as, quote, a sign that he was not welcome, but that unlocked doors were an invitation to come inside.
Shit remind me of that one dude in
Richard
Cali.
walked throughout his neighborhood, checking the locks on every single door he passed. Along the way, he ran into a woman he had gone to high school with, named Nancy Holden. Upon seeing Richard, Nancy was visibly frightened by his appearance. When Richard asked her for a ride, Nancy simply declined and went on her way. Little did Nancy know that she had quite literally come face to face with a man on his way to becoming a monster. After parting ways with Nancy, Richard continued walking down the streets of his neighborhood until he came across the home of a young married couple who had left their front door unlocked while they were out running errands. Richard let himself into the family's home and immediately started filling his pockets with valuables.
Broke ass nigga.
Richard then made his way into the bedrooms of the couple's children and urinated in the clothing drawer belonging to the couple's infant son, and even defecated on their son's bed. As Richard made his way to the front door to leave, he realized that the family had just arrived back home before he could escape. Upon seeing Richard inside the house, the husband rushed at him in an attempt to prevent Richard from doing any harm to his wife and children. The attack on Richard was short-lived and ultimately resulted in him escaping before the husband could do any serious harm.
What? Boy, he just
Instead of taking the close call
he just sit and pissed in your infant son room and you ain't gonna hurt that nigga?
Warning. Richard proceeded to check out other homes in his neighborhood. Eventually, on January 23rd, 1978, Richard came across the home of David and Teresa Wallin. David and Teresa were a young married couple who were newly pregnant with their first child. When Richard first approached the Wallin home, he noticed that David was not there and that Teresa was alone.
Oh, man.
Richard found the front door unlocked as Teresa, who was 3 months pregnant, had been taking out the trash. Seeing the unlocked door as a sign that he was welcome to enter, Richard let himself into the home. When Teresa entered the house once more, she was shocked to find Richard standing in her living room. Before she could even react, Richard fired 3 rounds at her with his .22. The first bullet entered through Teresa's hand as she had defensively reached up to block the shot, while the other 2 killed her instantly.
Rest in peace.
Richard then brought her body to the couple's bedroom and assaulted it post-mortem. Richard also repeatedly stabbed Teresa's lifeless body and carved her up in order to remove several of her organs. He even went so far as to collect Teresa's blood in a bucket that he later used to bathe in. Richard further mutilated Teresa's body, drank her blood, and even put a pile of dog feces in her mouth before finally leaving the premises before her husband came home. As the investigation into Teresa's violent murder started,
how have I
Richard
never
knew
heard
that
about
his
this?
days of freedom were numbered, as he had left DNA and other evidence all around the crime scene. Just 2 days after killing Teresa, on January 25th, Richard still wasn't satisfied. So when he noticed that one of his neighbors was selling newborn puppies from their family dog's litter, Richard bought 2
This nigga, why is he just not losing?
of them. He then took them home to his apartment, killed them, and drank their blood as he did with all of his other victims, both animal and human. Then he returned the lifeless bodies of the puppies to the neighbor's front porch. Though he took pleasure in such a horrific endeavor, Richard's thirst for blood was nowhere near satiated. So on January 27th, Richard set out to complete what would end up being his final murders. While wandering through his neighborhood once more, Richard came across the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Maroth. At the time, Evelyn had been babysitting her 22-month-old nephew, David Ferreira, and Evelyn's own 6-year-old son, Jason. While Evelyn was watching over the 2 children, another neighbor and friend, Danny Meredith, had come over to check on her and the boys to ensure that everything was going smoothly. Danny offered to keep an eye on both David and Jason while Evelyn took a quick bath, which Evelyn graciously accepted. While Evelyn was in the bath, Danny walked to the front hallway of the home. When he reached the end of the hallway, he was shocked to be met face to face with Richard, who was pointing his .22 directly at Danny's head. Before he even had the chance to scream, Richard fired a single shot into Danny, killing him instantly. When Danny's lifeless body slumped to the floor, Richard quickly removed his wallet and keys from his pockets. When young Jason and David heard the sound of the gunshot, they knew that something wasn't right.
Yo, Tim, I don't give a fuck if you turn 26 next week, you old
but
bitch.
Richard ended up shooting the 6-year-old twice in the head
Rest in peace,
before
man.
he could make it. As Jason lay dead on the floor, Richard proceeded to shoot and kill 22-month-old David as well. Evelyn had tried to get herself out of the bath to help the children and investigate the gunshots, but she was stopped when Richard walked into the doorway of the bathroom.
God.
Without even the slightest hint of a flinch, Richard shot Evelyn where she stood. He then brought her lifeless body into her own bedroom and assaulted it, all while drinking her blood at the same time. During that time, Richard was surprised to hear the sound of someone knocking at the door of the home he had turned into a crime scene. Startled by the 6-year-old girl who had stopped by the house for a scheduled playdate with Jason, Richard fled from the home and used Danny's car to escape. The little girl went on to alert the neighbors, who ended up breaking into the Maroth home, only to discover the horrendous crime scene. A neighbor quickly contacted police, who were shocked by the events that had occurred just moments prior to their arrival. In his narrow escape, Richard managed to take David's body home with him. Eventually, Richard disposed of David's body at a nearby church.
I swear he only got away with this shit because it was the fucking 80s
murders,
and 70s, and
the
he's born
entirety
in the
of East
1950s with his
Sacramento was on
old
high
ass.
alert. They had never seen such
here.
a violent killer as the Vampire of Sacramento, as Richard came to be known. A profile for the killer in the Teresa Wallin murder was constructed by members of the FBI and concluded that the person responsible for such a death would be tall, malnourished, a loner, physically unclean, and that, most importantly, he would continue to kill. When investigators looked over the crime scene at the Maroth home, they found perfect handprints and footprints left in blood throughout the house.
Finally?
Ones that could
Niggas
only
couldn't find this
belong
shit
to
the
the
first time?
mysterious killer who had been running rampant in the neighborhood. Just 5 days after the Maroth home murders, Nancy Holden, Richard's friend from high school who had just narrowly escaped Richard's devious plans, heard the police report for herself. More importantly, she learned of the profile that investigators had created for the killer. Every bone in her body told her that Richard was the man who fit the FBI's description. So, Nancy called the police and explained her theory. Police then ran a background check on Richard and ended up finding his registration of a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, the same weapon that had been used in all 6 of the recent Sacramento murders.
Easy.
Detectives stormed Richard's apartment, where he was inevitably arrested while trying to escape once more. Every article of clothing on Richard's body was stained with blood. When investigators made their way inside his apartment, they were appalled by the sheer amount of blood on nearly every inch of the unit. In fact, blood was found on the walls, floor, ceiling, refrigerator, and all of Richard's utensils. Upon being questioned on the blood, Richard told police he had simply killed a variety of dogs. But when police searched Richard's body, they found that he still had Danny's wallet in his possession. Further searches of Richard's apartment found coagulated blood, rotting matter of internal organs, several animal body parts, David's brains in a container in the fridge, and several of both Evelyn and Teresa's organs. It was beyond evident that investigators had officially located the Vampire of Sacramento, and he was even more horrifying than anyone could have ever imagined. At his trial in 1979, Richard Chase pled not guilty to 6 counts of murder by reason of insanity. Despite his history of mental illness, Richard was actually deemed legally sane at the time he committed the crimes and ended up being found guilty on all 6 counts of murder on May 8th that same year. After the verdict was determined, Richard was sentenced to be executed by gas chamber. Following conviction, Richard was prescribed medication to help his evident mental issues.
Man, fuck his mental issues.
However,
the fuck?
Richard only ever pretended to take his medication. Instead, he actually stockpiled a plethora of the pills until he believed he had accumulated enough to take his own life. On December 26, 1979, before he could face his legal sentence, Richard was found dead in his prison cell. His autopsy determined that Richard had managed to overdose on prison doctor-prescribed antidepressants.
Let's fucking go. Good riddance, fucking loser.
Richard Chase's name is not often remembered, though the city of Sacramento will never forget the heinous crimes committed by the vampire-like man who left the entire city in fear throughout the late 1970s. And though you may not have known of him prior to watching this video,
never heard of him,
I doubt that you will be able to forget his unbelievable story anytime soon.
To be honest,
what did you...
I already forgot about it. He's just a Jeffrey Dahmer wannabe, to be honest. I already forgot about it. He's a bitch.